Shoot her. Viktor Petrov said it the way other men order coffee. Calm, certain, final. The translator dropped to his knees, begged in 3 languages. Petrov watched, not with cruelty, with patience, the patience of a man who has never once been made to wait for what he wants. Then the gun fired, and Petrov straightened his coat, stepped over the body, and ordered the canyon sealed, not because the mission demanded it, but because he could, because no one had ever stopped him. 8 American operators were about to find out that someone finally had. She just wasn't who any of them expected. Before we go any further, if stories like this hit you somewhere deep, somewhere real, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The mountain did not care who lived or died on it.
That was the first thing Commander Jake Miller had learned in 22 years of special operations terrain. Has no loyalty. Snow doesn't pick sides. Cold doesn't negotiate. The Hindu Kush range in northeastern Afghanistan was older than every war ever fought inside it, and it would be standing long after the last helicopter pulled away from the last body. Jake knew this. He had always known this. But knowing it and feeling it at the same time, that was a different thing entirely. He pressed his back against a rock shelf that jutted out from the mountain face like a broken jaw, and he counted. Not seconds. He counted the sound of incoming fire the way a man who has survived long enough learns to read a firefight by its rhythm. Short bursts to the left, that was the eastern position. The heavier, slower cadence above him, that was elevated ground, maybe 60 meters up, maybe more. And beneath all of it, like a bass note under noise, the single crack of a high-powered rifle from somewhere he couldn't immediately identify. That last sound was the one that didn't fit. Miller. The voice in his earpiece belonged to Chief Petty Officer Danny Okafor, who was covering the team's southern flank 30 meters back. We've got a problem. I know we have a problem, Danny. No, sir. A different problem. Reyes is hit. Jake closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. 1 second to feel that. 1 second to absorb it. Then he opened them again and said, "How bad?" "Upper left shoulder, through and through. He's still functional, but he's bleeding heavy. And Rodriguez is, where is Rodriguez?" A pause that lasted too long. "That's actually the other problem, sir." Jake Miller had led SEAL Team 9 through 11 confirmed combat deployments. He had operated in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and twice in places that officially did not exist on any map. He had seen teammates wounded, extracted, carried off mountains on other men's backs. He had given orders that cost people their lives and orders that saved them, and sometimes he had given the same order and gotten both results at once. But in all of that, in 22 years, he had never not once lost track of a team member in a hot zone. Until tonight. "Find her," he said. His voice was flat, controlled. The tone his team recognized as the one that meant he was past anger and into something colder. "Find her right now." "Sir." This was Sergeant First Class Alex Cooper cutting into the channel from the northern position. Cooper was the team's senior breacher and the loudest personality in any room, a 6'2" Louisiana man who had opinions about everything and kept most of them, unfortunately to himself, only when he was actively being shot at. "Sir, I've got eyes on the medic." "Tell me." "She's not where I left her." "I know she's not where you left her, Cooper. That's the entire problem." "Where is she now?" Another pause, longer this time. "That's what I'm trying to tell you, sir. She's up on the secondary shelf, the one we assessed as unsecurable. She's up there." Jake turned his head, looked up and to his right through the smoke and the dark and the snow that was falling now in thin, sharp sheets, and he saw what Cooper was describing. The secondary shelf, a 40-foot ledge of exposed rock above their current position, accessible by a near vertical scramble that none of them had even considered using because the exposure alone would have gotten a person killed in 30 seconds. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was lying flat on it, not cowering, not hiding. Prone, arms extended in front of her, her cheek pressed against something long and dark. Jake stared. He watched her body go absolutely still, the kind of still that isn't panic, isn't shock, isn't the paralysis of a civilian who has found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a different stillness, deliberate, architectural, the stillness of someone who had arranged every part of themselves into a single purpose. Then the shot came. The crack of it was different from the enemy fire, sharper, singular, with a purpose in it that ordinary gunfire rarely had. One clean sound. And below and to the left of Jake's position, an enemy fighter who had been moving through cover toward their southern flank simply stopped moving. He didn't spin. He didn't cry out. He sat down against the rock he'd been using for cover, and then he was still in a different way entirely. Jake Miller said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then, did she just— "Yeah," said Okafor quietly. "Yeah, she did." Another crack. The elevated position that had been hammering them with the slower, heavier fire went silent. 2 shots, 2 targets, 2 problems that had been trying to kill his team 30 seconds ago and were now simply gone. The firefight didn't stop. There were still fighters on the eastern approach, and the sound of movement above told Jake there was at least one more position he hadn't fully located yet, but it had changed. The pressure had shifted. The rhythm of incoming fire had a new element of hesitation in it, the way a pack of predators sometimes hesitates when something they didn't account for enters the equation. Jake pressed the transmit button on his radio. "Rodriguez." His voice was careful. He wasn't sure what he was asking exactly. He said her name as though it were a question. A moment passed. Then her voice came through the earpiece, calm, focused, slightly out of breath from whatever route she had taken to get up there. "Still here, Commander? What are you— He stopped, reformulated. "What exactly are you doing up there?" "Keeping your team alive," she said. And then before he could respond, "Eastern position. 3 fighters, 20 meters moving to flank. I have a line on the lead." Jake's tactical brain processed this before his emotional brain could complicate it. He said, "Take it." The third crack. The eastern flanking movement collapsed. Corporal James Thorne, who was pinned behind a boulder 15 meters from Jake's position, exhaled audibly into the radio. "Holy language," said Danny Okafor reflexively. "Are you serious right now?" Force of habit. But even in the absurdity of that exchange, even in the very specific American military comedy that surfaces when men are terrified and trying not to show it, Jake Miller was still watching the ledge above him. Still watching Dr. Elena Rodriguez reposition herself with a smoothness that didn't belong to anyone he'd ever known as a medic. She moved the way water moves when it finds a path, not fast, not slow, but inevitable. Like she'd been on ledges like this before. Like the rock under her hands was familiar. Like she'd been doing this exact thing in other mountains in other dark for a long time. "Okafor," Jake said quietly. "Sir?" "Reyes, how's Reyes for stable?" "She had him patched before she went up. I don't know how she had time to do both things, but she had him patched before she went up." Jake repeated this to himself more than to Okafor. Turned it over. A medic had stabilized a gunshot wound, assessed the tactical situation, identified unsecured high ground, climbed 40 feet of exposed rock under fire, set up a shooting position, and begun engaging targets with a precision that was honestly, genuinely, in his honest and genuine professional opinion, as a man who had seen some of the best shooters in the world work, that was better than anything he'd seen since a 2-week attachment to a British SAS sniper unit in 2019. The firefight died over the next 4 minutes. It didn't end dramatically. It ended the way most firefights end, which is gradually, unevenly, the way a fire goes out, not all at once, but piece by piece until there's only smoke where the flame was. The eastern fighters withdrew. The elevated position produced no more fire. Somewhere to the north, Cooper reported movement pulling back, which meant whoever was commanding the assault had reassessed and found the math unfavorable. When Jake finally lowered himself from behind the rock shelf and stood in the open air of the mountain, the cold hitting his face like a flat hand, he looked up at the ledge. She was already climbing down. Not fast, not reckless, measured. Every hand placement deliberate. Every foot finding rock before she shifted weight. The kind of movement that speaks of practice in environments where mistakes are educational only once. When she dropped the last 4 feet and landed beside him, Jake looked at her for a long moment. She was breathing a little hard. Her jacket was torn at the left elbow. She'd scraped it on the descent. There was a smear of blood on her right cheek that wasn't hers. Her eyes, in the thin light filtering through the snow clouds, were a dark brown that were very focused and very, very calm. She met his eyes without flinching. "Reyes needs a proper dressing when we get to a stable position," she said. "The patch I put on will hold for an hour, maybe 90 minutes in this cold. After that, it's going to need to be reset. Jake said, okay. The through and through missed the subclavian by about 4 centimeters. He got lucky. Okay. She started to move past him toward where Reyes was sheltering with Okafor. Jake said, Rodriguez. She stopped. Where did you learn to shoot like that? A pause, short but distinct. I've had range time, she said, and then she kept walking. Jake watched her go. He was still watching when Cooper appeared at his shoulder, which the big man did with surprising quiet for someone his size, and said in a low voice, stripped of his usual volume, Sir, that wasn't range time. No, Jake agreed, it wasn't. Who is she? Jake Miller didn't answer that, partly because he didn't know, and partly because the part of him that had been reading people in high-stakes environments for over 2 decades was already sorting through everything he'd just seen and arriving at a conclusion that made his chest feel oddly tight. Whoever Dr. Elena Rodriguez was, whatever her file said, whatever Colonel Hayes had told him before the mission brief, whatever the word medic meant when it was attached to her name, she was not primarily those things. She was primarily something else. And he had a feeling that whatever that something else was, it had a history, a weight to it, the kind of weight that people carry not when they have done something once, but when they've done something so many times that it has become part of the structure of who they are. He needed to know who she was. He just didn't know yet whether knowing would make him feel better or worse about the next 48 hours. 3 weeks earlier, the briefing room at Fort Carson had smelled like recycled air and bad coffee, and Commander Jake Miller had sat at a long table across from a woman he was already deciding he didn't trust. Not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she'd said anything that raised a flag, but because she was too still. In a room full of operators who move constantly shifting weight, checking gear, letting the restless physical energy of trained soldiers express itself in small muscular adjustments. Dr. Elena Rodriguez sat completely motionless in her chair, hands flat on the table, back straight, eyes on Colonel Hayes at the front of the room, tracking his words with the attentive neutrality of someone who was listening carefully but revealing nothing. Jake had spent 22 years learning to read bodies. Hers wasn't giving him anything. Colonel Robert Hayes had the particular bearing of a man who had survived in the intelligence-adjacent world long enough to be comfortable with ambiguity. He was not Special Forces himself, career Army intelligence, background, the kind of officer who operated in the spaces between departments and didn't feel the need to explain himself. When he told them 3 days before the actual mission brief that a civilian medical specialist would be joining the team for the extraction op, the reaction in the room had been what anyone would have expected. Controlled, professional, barely concealed annoyance. With respect, sir, Cooper had said, with a particular inflection he used when he meant precisely the opposite of with respect. We're extracting a nuclear physicist from a hostile mountain environment with unknown numbers of armed opposition. Adding a non-combatant to our force package is a liability. Dr. Rodriguez is not a non-combatant, Hayes had said. And then before anyone could follow up on that very loaded statement, she's a medical asset. Dr. Chun may be in poor physical condition after his captivity. We need someone who can assess and stabilize him for extraction. Rodriguez has field medical experience in extreme environments. What kind of field experience? Jake had asked. Humanitarian operations, high-risk zones. She's been in a lot of places most people don't volunteer to go, which was Jake had recognized at the time, an answer that answered nothing. He'd reviewed her file that night. Stanford Medical School, residency in trauma surgery at Johns Hopkins, then a series of humanitarian attachments, MSF in South Sudan, WHO consultation in Haiti, Red Cross work in, and here it got strange, several locations that were listed by region rather than country, with dates that didn't quite add up when you tried to map them chronologically. 8 years of her career occupied a section labeled simply Special Research Division, Collaborative Health Initiative. No further detail, no institutional affiliation that checked out when he tried to run it down. He'd mentioned this to his intelligence sergeant, a precise young man named Castillo, who had a gift for finding things that didn't want to be found. Castillo had come back to him the next morning, looking like a man who had opened a door expecting a closet and found a hallway. There's a gap, Castillo had said. Tell me about the gap. Between 2001 and 2009, she exists on paper. There are records, publications, professional registrations. But when you try to trace the physical locations, it falls apart. She's listed as being in Geneva when her badge records show her in somewhere else. A different kind of somewhere else. What kind of somewhere else? Castillo had looked at him carefully. The kind that shows up in certain documents that I technically don't have access to, but that sometimes appear in certain shared drives if you know where to look. Jake had said, and I don't think I should say what I found on those drives, sir. I think you should ask Colonel Hayes. Jake had asked Colonel Hayes. Hayes had looked at him with the expression of a man deciding how much truth to give someone who has asked for the whole truth and said, Elena Rodriguez is one of the best field assets I've ever worked with. I would trust her with my life, and I'm trusting her with yours. That's all you need right now. Which told Jake two things. One, Hayes knew exactly what was in those gaps, and two, he was choosing not to share it, which meant it was either classified above Jake's current access level, or it was the kind of information that changed the dynamic of a team in ways Hayes didn't want to manage on the front end of a mission. Both possibilities were uncomfortable. Jake had gone back to his original question, why does she move like that? Because she did. From the first moment he'd watched her cross the briefing room to pick up a mission packet, something about Elena Rodriguez's movement had been off in a way he couldn't name. Not wrong exactly, not suspicious in any visible way, just wrong adjacent. The economy of motion, the way she checked her sight lines when she entered a new space, the way she sat with her back to walls almost without seeming to notice she was doing it. He'd seen those habits before, in operators, in people who had spent extended time in environments where being unaware of your surroundings was a choice that didn't get a second chance. He had not expected to see them in a trauma surgeon. Cooper's assessment of Elena Rodriguez had been delivered in the team room the night before departure at approximately 11 p.m. when the team was running final gear checks and the air had that particular compressed quality that precedes operations. Everyone moving through the same habitual motions they'd run thousands of times, using the familiar to steady themselves against the unfamiliar ahead. She doesn't belong here, Cooper had said. Not quite loud enough to be aimed at her, but not quite quiet enough for it to be private. The team room was small. Elena was 12 feet away checking a medical kit with the methodical attention of someone who had packed kits like this under worse conditions than a fluorescent-lit army prep room. She didn't look up. She didn't react at all. Jake had watched her not react and felt that wrongness again, the dissonance between who she was supposed to be and who she was presenting. Okafor, who was the moral conscience of the team in the way that certain quiet men are, had said to Cooper, leave it. I'm just saying, leave it, Okafor had said again, and there was something in his voice that made Cooper leave it. Jake had walked over to Elena's position. Not to defend her, he didn't know yet whether she needed defending. But because he wanted to see her at close range, read her, he'd crouched beside the kit, looked at the organization of it. The layout was not standard. It wasn't the default triage arrangement he'd seen military medics use. It was reorganized in a way that prioritized different access. Some things moved forward that were usually in secondary pockets. Some things consolidated that were usually spread out. The way someone who has used a kit under fire would reorganize it, not the way someone who had packed kits in hospital environments would do it. You've changed the layout, he'd said. She'd looked at him steadily. The default puts sutures in a secondary pocket. If I'm working on someone with a chest wound in a confined space, I want sutures accessible without repositioning the whole kit. Standard field medics don't make that modification. A brief pause, her dark eyes on his. Then I suppose I'm not a standard field medic, Commander. She'd gone back to her inventory. Jake had stood and walked back to his own gear and had made a decision then that he would revisit after the mission. When this was over, he was going to find out who Elena Rodriguez actually was. Not what her file said, not what Hayes was willing to share. Actually was. He just hadn't expected the mountain to answer that question before he got the chance to ask it properly. In the aftermath of the firefight, as the team consolidated at a shelter point, 200 meters back from the contact zone, Jake watched his people. He watched them the way he always watched them in the minutes after a fight, not for wounds, because Okafor and Rodriguez were handling that systematically, but for the thing underneath the wound. The adjustment each person was making to absorb what had just happened and reconstitute themselves as functional operators. Thorne was quiet in a way that was okay. He processed internally, always had, and the quiet after a firefight meant he was doing what he needed to do. Cooper was louder than usual, talking more, moving around the excess energy of a big man who fights by instinct, and then has to find somewhere to put the instinct once the fighting stops. Reyes was sitting with his back against the shelter wall, while Rodriguez worked on his shoulder, and his face was doing the complicated thing that faces do when the adrenaline has left, but the pain hasn't fully arrived yet, and the mind is somewhere between the two, reviewing everything that just happened and inserting itself into all the moments that nearly went differently. Danny Okafor had a habit that Jake had noticed years ago and never commented on. When something was bothering him, he cleaned his weapon. Not because it needed cleaning, because his hands needed something to do while his mind worked through whatever it was working through. And right now in the half-dark of their shelter position, with the wind pressing against the walls, and Elena Rodriguez 3 feet away, redressing Reyes' shoulder, Danny Okafor was cleaning a rifle that he had cleaned 4 hours ago. Jake sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for almost 2 minutes. Then Okafor said quietly without looking up from the barrel, "She knew exactly where to go." Jake said, "What?" "The shelf, the secondary shelf. We walked that approach route twice during pre-mission reconnaissance. I remember looking at it and thinking, no, too exposed, no one goes up there, but she went straight to it. No hesitation, no assessment." He paused. "She knew before the firefight started that it was the best elevated firing position in that canyon section." Jake let that land. Because Okafor was right. He had been so focused on what she'd done on the shelf that he hadn't stopped to think about the decision that preceded it. The tactical decision. The pre-combat assessment that would have had to happen before the first round was ever fired. Elena Rodriguez hadn't scrambled up there in a panic. She had moved there with intention, which meant she had already mapped the terrain for firing positions. Not for medical evacuation routes, not for casualty collection points, for firing positions. "She's not what Hayes told us," Jake said. "No," Okafor agreed, "she's not." Across the shelter, Cooper was sitting against the far wall with his arms folded, watching Elena work on Reyes. His face had lost its usual animated quality, the perpetual readiness for argument or laughter that made him simultaneously the most exhausting and the most essential person in any team room. Right now, he just looked like a man trying to solve a problem he didn't have all the pieces for. Reyes hissed through his teeth as Elena pressed something into the wound margin, and she said without looking up, "I know, 2 more seconds." "You always say 2 more seconds," Reyes said. His voice was thin from blood loss and cold, but the complaint in it was genuine, which meant he was stable enough to be annoyed, which was a good sign. "And I'm always right," she said. Reyes laughed once, a short, painful sound, and then she was done, and he leaned his head back and closed his eyes with the expression of a man granting himself permission to feel relieved. "How long before he can move?" Jake asked. Elena looked up, found his eyes across the shelter. She had blood on her hands, still Reyes' blood, and she didn't seem to notice it the way a civilian would have noticed it. It was just information, occupational fact. 6 hours of rest, he moves well. 3 hours minimum before we can safely extract him at pace. If you push it before 3 hours. "I know," Jake said. "What about his shooting arm?" She held his gaze. "Left shoulder, he's right-handed." "I know that too." "Then you already know he's fine for action at 3 hours. She pulled a sealed cloth from the kit and began cleaning her hands with it. "I just prefer 6. We don't always get what we prefer out here." "No, Sue," she said, looking down at her hands. "We don't." The way she said it, not bitterly, not with self-pity, but with the flat acknowledgement of someone who had learned that truth somewhere specific and painful, made Jake set his jaw. He was going to ask her. Right now. He was going to ask her straight. He said, "Rodriguez?" She looked up. "Who trained you?" The shelter went quiet. Not suddenly, it was already quiet, but the quality of the quiet changed. Cooper stopped moving. Okafor's hands stilled on the rifle barrel. Even Reyes opened one eye. Elena looked at Jake for a long moment. Her expression didn't shift, didn't tighten, didn't do any of the things that expressions do when a person is caught off guard. Which in itself was an answer, because normal people, doctors, civilians, even experienced field medics, would have shown something in that moment. Surprise, confusion, defensiveness, something. She showed him nothing. And then she said, "I've had extensive training in austere environments. It goes beyond standard medical curriculum." "That's not what I asked." Another moment. Longer. "No," she said, "it's not." She went back to packing the medical kit. Jake watched her do it, and made himself not push. Not yet. Not here with the team watching and the mission still active, and Reyes needing her functional. But the question didn't leave it settled into the back of his thinking, where important unresolved things live patient and waiting. Castillo, who had been quiet in the corner, running comms checks, pulled off one earphone and said, "Commander, I've got updated intel on the Chun location." Jake crossed to us, crouched, looked at the tablet Castillo held. The imagery was thermal taken from a drone that had been orbiting the target area for the past 6 hours. A cluster of structures in a deep canyon valley, 8 kilometers from their current position. Heat signatures consistent with a group of people, 12, maybe 15, and one signature that was isolated. Separated from the others by what the imagery suggested was a single room. Dr. Marcus Chun, nuclear physicist, the man they'd come here to bring home. Movement pattern on the isolated signature, Jake asked. Minimal. He's either restrained or exhausted or both. Castillo pointed to a cluster of heat signatures near the structure's eastern approach. These are guards. They've been in position for at least 4 hours. Static, which means they're not anticipating us from this direction. Or they want us to think they're not. Castillo allowed this. Possible. Jake studied the imagery. His mind ran the approach vectors, the extraction routes, the contingencies for each. 8 kilometers in this terrain at night, with one man walking wounded. The math was tight, but it was workable if nothing else went wrong. He was not naive enough to believe nothing else would go wrong. How long to target, he asked, moving at pace with Reyes 4 hours minimum. Jake did the arithmetic. 3 hours rest for Reyes, 4 hours movement assault on the objective extraction back to the designated pickup zone. They were running against dawn. Daylight in this terrain with a nuclear physicist in tow and a depleted ammunition load was a different kind of problem than darkness. Wake everyone at the 3-hour mark, he said. We move. Castillo nodded and went back to his comms. Jake stood and turned and found Elena Rodriguez standing directly behind him, close enough that he had to stop short. She had the medical kit in one hand and her eyes on the thermal imagery still visible on Castillo's tablet. Her expression was doing something new. Not the carefully managed neutrality he'd seen in the shelter, but something more active. Something that looked, if he had to name it, like calculation. The isolated signature, she said. What's his heat pattern? Castillo looked at Jake. Jake gave a small nod. Castillo turned the tablet so she could see it better. Lower than the others, core temperature suppression consistent with exposure or malnourishment, or both. How long has the pattern looked like that? 6 hours of observation. It looked like that at the start of the observation window. She stared at the imagery for 3 more seconds. Then, he needs fluids and a warming protocol before he can be moved at any significant pace. If his core temperature is that depressed, pushing him hard in this cold will, I know, Jake said. Do you know, or are you saying you know? The directness of it, no apology in it, no softening, landed differently than Cooper's challenges ever did. Cooper challenged from ego. This was something else. This was someone who had been in positions where whether the person across from them actually knew or just thought they knew was the difference between someone living and someone not. Jake said, tell me what we need. Warming blanket, I have one in the kit. IV fluids. I have 2 liters enough for initial stabilization. He'll need 30 minutes at rest before movement at minimum, not negotiable on medical grounds. Understood. She looked at him. The calculation in her eyes hadn't left. You're not going to fight me on it. You're the medical authority on this team. When you tell me something is medically non-negotiable, I take that as a tactical constraint and I plan around it. Something moved in her expression. It was small, a slight release of something that had been held, and it was gone almost before it registered. But Jake caught it. In 22 years of reading, people under pressure, he caught it. She had expected him to argue. She had already built the argument against his argument in her head. And he hadn't argued, and whatever that meant to her, whatever history had made her expect the argument, it had briefly surfaced in her face before she put it back under. 30 minutes at the target, she said. I'll have him stable for movement. Good. She walked back to her position near Reyes. Cooper materialized beside Jake with the quiet he sometimes managed when he was being serious. He said very low, she's done this before. Jake said nothing. Not humanitarian work, Cooper continued. Not MSF tent camps and Red Cross supply runs. This, what we do. I know. So what does that mean for the mission? Jake looked at him. It means she's an asset. Cooper's jaw tightened. She lied about who she is. Hayes lied about who she is. That's different. Is it? Jake thought about this. Genuinely thought about it not as a rhetorical exercise, but as a real question. Because Cooper, for all his noise and bluster, occasionally asked real questions. Whether the lie belonged to the person or to the institution telling the story about the person was actually a meaningful distinction. It changed what the lie meant. It changed what you did with it. Yes, Jake said finally, it is. Cooper exhaled, looked at the floor, then looked back up. She should have told us. She probably wasn't allowed to. That doesn't make me feel better. It's not supposed to make you feel better, Jake said. It's supposed to give you context. Feeling better is your own project. Cooper absorbed this with the expression of a man who knows he's been handled fairly and resents it slightly anyway. Then he walked back to his position, and Jake let the conversation end because there was nothing more useful to say right now, and useful was the only currency that mattered in the next 12 hours. He looked over at Elena Rodriguez one more time. She was checking her own sidearm, not the medical kit, the weapon. Checking it with the particular efficiency of someone running a function check they've run so many times that it happens below the level of conscious. Thought magazine seated chamber, confirmed safety, assessed, reholstered. 6 seconds. Clean. She didn't look up. But Jake had the sudden, very clear sense that she knew he was watching her, that she had known since he turned to look, and that she had made a deliberate choice to check the weapon anyway. To let him see it, as if she was slowly, carefully in the way that people share truth when they can't share words trying to tell him something. He didn't push. He filed it. And he thought not for the first time about the 8 years her file couldn't account for, and what a person becomes in 8 years of doing things no file is allowed to describe. The shelter held its silence. Outside the mountain did what mountains do, indifferent, enormous, enduring. And Jake Miller sat with the particular exhaustion of a commander who has discovered mid-mission that the team he brought into the field is not quite the team he thought it was, and that this fact is simultaneously deeply unsettling, and though he couldn't quite articulate, why yet not entirely unwelcome. 3 hours. Then they moved. He closed his eyes for the first 40 minutes. Not sleeping operators don't sleep between contacts the way civilians sleep completely and trustingly. It was more like standing down while remaining at the door, the body resting while the mind kept its post. In those 40 minutes, uninvited and with the persistence of things that had been waiting for a quiet moment, the question kept reasserting itself. Not just who she was, but why Hayes had sent her. Not as cover, not as genuine medical support, though she clearly was capable of providing that, but as what? What was the actual function? What was the real mission parameter that required Elena Rodriguez specifically, and not any of the dozens of equally competent field medics the Army could have attached to this operation? Unless the medical cover wasn't the primary function, unless the mission had a layer that Hayes hadn't briefed, unless Dr. Marcus Chun, nuclear physicist, kidnapped victim, the man they were risking 8 lives to extract from a mountain fortress, unless Marcus Chun was connected to something that required Elena Rodriguez's particular skill set, not her medical skill set, the other one. Jake opened his eyes. He looked across the shelter at her. She was sitting with her back straight against the wall, eyes closed, hands loose in her lap. Resting the way he was resting, present, but withdrawn, the practiced conservation of energy that people develop when energy has been the difference. Her face in rest was different from her face in activity. The management came down slightly. The architecture of control relaxed just enough to show the person under it. She was younger looking in rest, or maybe older, he couldn't decide which. The kind of face that carries something. The kind of face that has looked at things and been changed by them and then rebuilt itself over the change. He thought about what Castillo had said, the gap, the years. He thought about what a person looks like after they have spent years being something that no file is allowed to name, and he thought about what it cost to put that down, to bury it in a medical degree and humanitarian postings and a name that shows up in the right publications, in the right places, and then to carry it anyway invisibly everywhere you go. He thought she's exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with tonight. And then he thought, but she came anyway. Whatever she was running from, whatever Bosnia or before Bosnia or the years the file couldn't account for had put inside her, She had still gotten on a helicopter and flown into a mountain range and attached herself to a SEAL team extraction op in Afghanistan. That took a specific kind of person, not a reckless one, not a damaged one in the way that damaged is sometimes used to excuse people for bad judgment. A driven one, purposeful in a way that pointed at something specific. He was going to find out what that something was. At the 2.5-hour mark, Castillo touched his shoulder and said, "Sir, comms traffic on the encrypted band we've been monitoring." Jake was fully alert in the half-second it took Castillo to finish the sentence. He crossed to the comms position, put the earpiece in. What he heard was Russian. Not words he understood. His Russian was functional, but not fluent, and the transmission was partial static cut compressed. But Castillo, whose language skills were one of the reasons he'd been selected for this team, was already writing on his notepad, translating in real time. The handwriting was fast and a little angular from the cold but readable. Jake read it over his shoulder. He read it twice. Then he looked up and across the shelter. "Rodriguez," he said. She opened her eyes immediately. No transition from rest to wakefulness, just present. "Does the name Petrov mean anything to you?" The change in her face was not what he expected. He had expected a flicker, a moment of calculation, the same assessment he'd seen when she looked at the thermal imagery, the strategic processing of new information. What happened instead was different. What happened was that every carefully maintained layer of Elena Rodriguez's composure did not crack. Cracking implies breaking apart. It did something more controlled than that. It compressed, as if something large and old and still alive had moved behind her eyes, and she had pressed it down with both hands, and only the effort of pressing it showed. Only for a second. Only for 1 second. Then she was steady again. "Victor Petrov," she said, not a question. The comms traffic mentions him in connection with the Chun extraction. Castillo thinks it's a coordination message. Someone inside the target structure is reporting to someone outside it. Jake watched her face. The name on the outside end of that message is Petrov. Silence. Cooper, who had heard, was very still. Okafor was looking at Elena with an expression Jake couldn't read. Reyes had opened both eyes. Elena said in a voice that was absolutely level and absolutely controlled, "Victor Petrov is not a facilitator. He doesn't coordinate extractions. He commands operations." A pause. If his name is on that comms traffic, this isn't a hostage situation. "Then what is it?" Jake asked. She looked at him, and in her eyes, beneath the control, beneath the compression of the thing she was holding down, Jake Miller saw something he had not expected to see in the eyes of a person who moved like she moved and held herself like she held herself. He saw something that looked very specifically like guilt. "It's a setup," she said. "The hostage is real, the rescue is real, but there's a third layer that I don't think your mission brief included." "How do you know what my mission brief included?" "Because if it had included Petrov," she said quietly, "they would have sent someone different." The shelter went so still that Jake could hear the wind finding the gaps in the walls. "Or," she said, and her voice was lower now, "they sent me specifically because of Petrov. And Hayes didn't tell you that either." Jake said, "Why would they send you because of Petrov?" She looked at him for a long time. The thing behind her eyes moved again. She held it. "Because," she said, "the last person who had a chance to stop Victor Petrov and didn't," she stopped, breathed once. "That person owes him a debt." No one spoke. The wind pressed at the walls. Jake said very carefully, "Are you saying you know Petrov?" "Yes." "Personally?" "Yes." "From before?" She held his gaze. "From a long time before." Cooper said from across the shelter, "How long before?" She looked at him, then back at Jake. And what she gave them then was not the full truth Jake could tell. It wasn't the full truth, but it was true as far as it went. "Long enough," she said, "that I am probably the reason Marcus Chun is in that building right now." The silence that followed that sentence lasted a long time. It lasted long enough for Reyes to sit up slowly against the wall, pain and alertness together in his face. Long enough for Cooper to unfold his arms and let them drop. Long enough for Castillo to set down his notepad and look at Elena with an expression that was not accusation, but was something in that neighborhood. Long enough for Danny Okafor to set down his rifle completely fully on the floor beside him and look at Elena Rodriguez the way Danny Okafor looked at things he was taking seriously, which was the most serious look Jake had ever seen on a human face. And Elena Rodriguez sat in the middle of all of that, in the middle of 6 operators who had just had the ground shifted under them, and she did not look away from any of it. She did not explain further. She did not apologize. She did not retreat into the careful neutrality she'd been maintaining since Fort Carson. She just let them look at her. Like a person who has been carrying something too long and has finally found a room where putting it down is possible, even if putting it down changes everything. Jake said, "When this is over." He said it quietly, but every word was distinct. "You're going to tell me everything." She said yes. All of it. Yes. Because right now we're going into that building without complete information, and people could die because of information we don't have, and that is not acceptable to me. "I know," she said. "I know it's not." And the guilt was there again, plainly visible, now not hidden. "I'm sorry, there are things I was instructed not to." "I understand that," Jake said. "I understand instructions, but we're past instructions now." He held her eyes. "Agreed." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something settled in her face. Something that had been braced released slightly, the way weight shifts when a decision is made. "Agreed," she said. Jake nodded. He stood, looked around the shelter at his team. At Okafor and Cooper and Reyes and Castillo, each of them processing in their own way what had just been said and what it meant and what they were walking into in 45 minutes. "We adapt," he said into the room. "We always adapt. We don't know everything about this mission, and we're going in anyway because that man in that building deserves to come home, and that's what we do. We bring people home." He paused. "And we do it together, all of us." His eyes moved to Elena. "All of us." She looked back at him. And Jake Miller, who had been reading people in high-stakes environments for 22 years, saw something in Dr. Elena Rodriguez's eyes that he had not seen in them before. Not gratitude, not relief. Resolve. The particular, specific, bone-deep resolve of a person who has been waiting for a long time for the moment when they could finally finish something that was left unfinished. When they could step back into the place where something went wrong and try to make it right. He didn't know the full story yet, but standing in that shelter 45 minutes from an objective with the mountain outside doing what mountains do, he understood enough. He understood that whatever Elena Rodriguez had been, whoever Wraith 7 had been in the years the file didn't speak about, she was here now, in this shelter, on this mountain, with his team, and whatever happened next, she was going in with them. They moved out at the 3-hour mark exactly. Jake gave the order, and the team assembled with the particular wordless efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the choreography lives in muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Gear checked. Weapons up. Rayo's on his feet, pale but steady, his left arm immobilized against his chest, his right hand on his rifle with a grip that said he was functional and intended to stay that way. Elena was last in the stack. Jake had put her there deliberately not to sideline her, but because last in a moving file is the position that requires the most independent judgment, the widest awareness, the fastest reaction to anything coming from behind. He'd put her there because after what he'd seen on that ledge, it was the position he trusted her to hold. She hadn't commented on the placement. She'd just taken her position. That in itself told him something. They moved in silence. 8 kilometers in this terrain was not 8 kilometers on flat ground. It was 8 kilometers of angled rock and loose shale and wind that pushed against you with genuine malice, and all of it in darkness that the thermal optics helped with but didn't solve. Jake led from the front, Castillo behind him, working the route navigation, and between them and Elena, the rest of the team moved in the compressed, purposeful quiet that is one of the things special operations does better than almost anything else. For the first 40 minutes, no one spoke on the internal channel beyond the minimum positional calls, hazard markers, pace count confirmations. It was in that silence, moving through the dark, with the cold pressing in from every direction, that Jake Miller found his mind going somewhere he hadn't expected it to go. He found it going back to what Elena had said. "I am probably the reason Marcus Chun is in that building right now." He had filed it. He'd thought he was good at filing things. It was one of the disciplines of command, the ability to take information that requires processing and place it in a temporary hold while the immediate task received full attention. But the filing wasn't the same as not feeling it. and what he felt working through the implications of those words as his boots found the next piece of ground and his eyes swept the darkness ahead was something complicated. Not anger. Not yet. Anger required more information than he currently had. Anger without information was just noise, and Jake Miller did not do noise. What he felt was the particular weight of a mission that has more dimensions than it was presented as having. The weight of walking into something with a map that you've just discovered is incomplete. And underneath that fainter, quieter, harder to name, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Because whatever Elena Rodriguez had done or failed to do, or been part of that she was now trying to undo, she had come here, she had gotten on the helicopter. She had climbed 40 feet of exposed rock under fire and done what needed to be done without being asked. That wasn't the behavior of someone who had given up on an obligation. That was the behavior of someone who was paying a debt. At the 50-minute mark, Castillo's hand came up, fist closed. Stop. The team froze. Castillo turned his head 45 degrees left and held it there. Jake read the body language and looked left. In the thermal optics at the edge of the display, range 2 heat signatures were moving not toward them, parallel to their route, at a distance of maybe 200 meters. Moving with purpose. Guards on a patrol route. Too far for immediate threat. Close enough to be a problem if their route intersected. Jake looked at the map overlay on his wrist display. The patrol route, if maintained, would cross their planned approach corridor in approximately 8 minutes. He touched Castillo's shoulder, 2 fingers down, then a redirect angle. Castillo nodded, adjusted the route calculation. They moved again, bearing 15 degrees south of the original line, adding distance, but removing the intersection. It cost them 11 minutes. Jake did not look back at Elena during the reroute. He didn't need to. When he checked the tail of the file at the next position, halt, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, watching their back trail, with the weapon up and her body turned at the angle that gave maximum coverage. She was doing her job. All of her job. He turned back to the front and kept moving. At the 1 hour 40 mark, with the target structures visible on thermal, at approximately 400 meters, Jake called a halt at a position behind a rock formation that gave good concealment and a clear sight line. The team went to ground. Castillo spread the updated imagery on the tablet, and they assembled around it. Guard pattern has changed, Castillo said, keeping his voice to the flat minimum that carries to the people around you without carrying further. 2 additional signatures on the eastern approach since the last drone pass. Someone reacted to our contact earlier tonight. They know we're in the area, Cooper said. They know someone is. They may not know our exact strength or position. May not, Cooper repeated, with the inflection that noted the gap between may not and don't. What about Chun? Jake asked. Castillo pointed to the isolated signature. Still separated. Still lower heat than the others. Still alive. No change in his position. They haven't moved him. If they knew we were coming for him, they'd have moved him, Okafor said. Or they want us to come for him, Elena said. Every head turned. She was looking at the tablet, not at them at the imagery. Her eyes were moving across the heat signatures in a pattern that was methodical in a way that was not medical. She was reading a tactical picture. The additional guards on the eastern approach, she said. Where were they before? Castillo checked the earlier imagery. Western side of the structure, interior position. They moved their interior security to an exterior approach vector after we made contact. She paused. That's not a defensive response. A defensive response pulls security inward to protect the asset. Moving them out means they want to engage any approaching force in the open away from the structure. Silence. Jake said, they want us in the open. They want us committed to an approach before we know the full guard strength. If we come in on the eastern vector, the way your route suggests, we'd be walking into a prepared kill zone, Cooper said. He said it flatly, the way facts get stated when they're unpleasant but need to be said cleanly. Are you sure? Elena looked at him. No, I'm reading the same imagery you are, but the pattern is consistent with a prepared position, not a reactive one. They've had time to set this up. How much time? Jake asked. If Petrov is coordinating, she stopped. Her jaw tightened briefly. Petrov plans in layers. He sets conditions hours before contact is expected. He would have anticipated that any rescue operation would come on a standard approach vector and prepared accordingly. You know how he plans, Jake said. Not a question, a statement. A statement with a lot underneath it that he was choosing not to unpack right now because right now they had 400 meters between them and a building and a man who needed to come home. Yes, she said. Then tell me how we get around it. She looked at the imagery again, her head tilted slightly. Jake recognized the angle. It was the angle of someone solving a problem, running variables, arriving at something. He'd seen it on the faces of his best operators before they delivered a plan that worked. Northern side, she said. There's a structure element on the north face that the thermal shows as low occupancy. One signature, possibly a sentry who's been in position long enough to be cold. Single point entry with suppressed approach. If we take that sentry before he can signal we're inside, before the eastern guards know contact has been made. Castillo was already checking the imagery against the structural assessment. He looked up. She's right about the north face. One signature. Cold, he's been static for at least 90 minutes. A tired cold sentry is a compromisable sentry, Okafor said. It's a tighter approach, Cooper said. Less room if it goes wrong. It goes wrong on the eastern approach, and we're in the open with prepared positions on both sides, Elena said. It goes wrong on the north face, and at least we're inside the problem, not exposed to it. Cooper looked at Jake. Jake looked at Cooper. Between them passed the communication that long-term partners pass without words, the weighing of the argument on its merits, independent of who made it. She's right, Cooper said. He didn't sound happy about it. He sounded like a man giving credit where credit was earned. North face, Jake made the call. North face, Castillo recalculate, we move in 12. The team dispersed back to their positions. Castillo worked the route. Reyes did a quiet function check of his rifle one-handed with the practiced economy of someone who has rehearsed this contingency. Okafor closed his eyes for 2 minutes, not sleeping. Jake knew just doing whatever Okafor did when he needed to center himself before contact. Jake moved to Elena's position. She was watching the north face approach vector through her optics. He crouched beside her. For a moment, they were just two people looking at the same piece of ground. Then he said low, after we get Chun out. She kept her eyes on the objective. I know. All of it. Love it, she agreed. He almost left it there, almost stood and moved back to his position and let the mission take over the way missions do, consuming everything else until there's nothing left but the task. But instead, he said, and he wasn't sure why, except that something about the weight she was carrying made him want to acknowledge it without making it bigger. Whatever you did or didn't do, you're here now. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, sometimes being here now isn't enough. No, he said, but it's what we've got. She looked at him then, briefly. The optics were down, and in the dark, her face was all shadow and the particular quality of someone who has heard something they needed to hear and are not sure yet what to do with it. Then she looked back at the objective, and Jake stood and moved to the front of the stack. 12 minutes later, they were moving. The north face approach took 22 minutes of careful movement. The sentry was exactly where the thermal had shown him. One man cold and bored and tired, in the specific way of a person who has been standing a post for too long in weather that punishes stillness. Okafor took him with a technique that left no noise and no signal sent, and they were through the entry point and inside the structure before the Eastern Guards completed their next rotation. Inside the structure was dark and close and warm, in the disorienting way that enclosed spaces feel warm after extended cold exposure. 3 rooms visible from the entry point. Voices Russian and Pashto mixed coming from deeper in. Jake hand signaled. The team split into 2 elements. Cooper and Thorne holding the entry, and the interior approach Jake and Okafor and Castillo, moving for Chun's position, Elena in the movement element, because she'd need to be first to Chun's side the moment they reached him. They were moving through the second room when the voice came. Not a shout, not an alarm, a voice calm, carrying with the particular unhurried quality of someone who is not surprised. In English. Commander Miller. Jake stopped. The team stopped. The voice came from somewhere ahead, from the direction of Chun's room, from the darkness beyond the doorway they were about to enter. It was male, accented but fluent, and it said his name with the ease of someone reading it off a document they've had time to review. I've been expecting your team for several hours, the voice said. Please don't do anything that makes this more complicated than it needs to be. Cooper's voice came over the internal channel from the entry position. Sir, we've got movement at the eastern approach. Multiple signatures moving inward. They were waiting. Jake's mind ran the geometry in 2 seconds flat, entry behind them being cut off, voice ahead of them, Chun somewhere in that darkness. The Eastern guards who weren't defensive but offensive repositioned to seal the exit once the team was committed to the interior. He said on the internal channel, "Hold entry. Do not engage unless fired upon." Then he said to the darkness ahead, "Who am I speaking to?" A pause. Theatrical. The pause of a man who enjoys the moment before he reveals something. Someone who has been waiting, the voice said, for a much longer time than tonight. And then from the shadows of the doorway, a figure stepped partially into the thin ambient light that filtered through from somewhere above. Jake saw him for only a moment long enough to register a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing the clothes of someone who had not been roughing it in the mountains, but had arrived here from somewhere comfortable. Well-fed, patient-looking, the kind of man who had never once been made to hurry. Behind Jake, Elena Rodriguez made a sound. It was very small, just an intake of breath, controlled immediately cut off in less than a second. But Jake heard it, and he felt the change in her body's proximity to his, the slight forward shift of a person whose weight has moved towards something without the conscious decision to move. He put his arm back without looking, not a grab, just a bar, a physical presence that said, "Wait." She stopped. But the tension coming off her was something he could feel, something compressed and old, and alive that had just encountered the specific object it had been under pressure about for what he was beginning to understand was a very long time. "Petrov," she said, not loudly, barely above the level of the internal channel, but the name carried. The figure in the doorway was still for a moment. Then he said with the warmth of a man greeting someone he's genuinely pleased to see, "Wraith 7. The name hit the room like a physical thing. Jake felt Cooper go still at the entry position without needing to see it. Felt Okafor beside him do the same controlled stillness he'd done in the shelter when Elena had said what she'd said. And he felt Elena Rodriguez behind his arm, felt the tremor in her that wasn't fear. He'd felt fear in people before. This was different. This was the specific full-body tension of someone standing in front of an unresolved moment that has waited years to become resolved. This was a person facing the exact thing they came here to face. And Jake kept his arm where it was, not because he didn't trust her, because this was a room and rooms had walls, and Chun was somewhere behind that man, and 4 operators were moving to seal the exit, and the immediate tactical problem required sequencing that he needed 5 seconds to work out. 5 seconds, he said to Petrov. "Where is Chun?" "Safe," Petrov said. "Entirely safe. He's been a cooperative guest." A pause. More cooperative than I expected from a man of his particular value. "We're taking him home." "Of course you are. That was always the plan." The warmth in his voice didn't change. It was the warmth of a man holding all the cards and in no hurry to show them. "The question is, what else goes home with him?" Jake said, "I don't negotiate with Oinen." "You're not negotiating," Petrov said. "I am informing you." A beat. "There is a drive. Small device currently in Dr. Chun's possession. He agreed to carry it when I explained the alternative. The drive contains things that your government will very much not want made public. The terms for that drive's non-release are simple, and I will tell them to you once clearly, so there is no misunderstanding." The silence stretched. Then Petrov said, and his voice dropped a register, losing the warmth, gaining something that was its honest underside. "Or I could skip the terms entirely and speak directly to the person in your team who understands the history better than anyone." He looked past Jake, at Elena. "You've been carrying what happened in Sarajevo for a long time," Petrov said. "I want you to know I never blamed you. The miss, the team, all of it." A pause, the particular pause of a man delivering a line he has rehearsed because he knew this moment would come. "I understood." Jake felt Elena's arm press forward against his. He held it. She said, and her voice was absolutely, completely, eerily level. "You killed them. Events killed them. I survived events, as did you. We are, you and I, the same kind of person. We are not the same kind of anything." "No." The warmth returned slightly. "You're here with a gun in a foreign country, having already killed 3 men tonight. I'm here with a gun in a foreign country, having built an operation that brought you specifically to this room." He let that sit. "Explain to me the meaningful difference." The difference, Elena said, is that I'm done missing. And Jake Miller, who had been holding his arm across her path for 5 seconds, while his mind ran the geometry, made a decision. He dropped his arm, not because he had a plan that was complete, because he had a plan that was good enough, and because Elena Rodriguez had just said something that was not a statement. It was a declaration, and people who make declarations in rooms like this one have already committed to what comes next. He stepped left. Castillo and Okafor read it instantly. They moved right, splitting the angle, covering the doorway on both sides. Cooper's voice came over the channel. Entry sealed from inside. I have the Eastern Guards contained at the threshold. They're not moving in, which meant Petrov's backup wasn't moving, which meant Petrov had told them to wait, which meant Petrov wanted this conversation to happen, wanted Elena in this room in front of him, precisely here and precisely now. Jake followed what it meant that a man like Petrov would engineer a scenario specifically to put Elena Rodriguez in this room. He filed it and he kept his eyes on the doorway. Elena walked forward. She walked the way she'd climbed that ledge, not fast, not slow. Inevitable. Every step placed with a certainty that it was not bravado which announces itself, but something older and quieter than bravado. The certainty of someone who has been walking toward a specific moment for a very long time and has finally arrived at it. She stopped 3 meters from the doorway. Petrov looked at her. For the first time since he'd stepped into the light, something in his face shifted. The warmth adjusted. Something real surfaced in it, not fear, not quite, but the specific alertness of a person who has planned for a scenario and is now measuring whether the real version matches the plan. The drive, Elena said. Give it to me. That's not how this works. It is now. He studied her. You have no leverage. I have your nuclear physicist. I have your exit sealed. You have nothing, she said. Petrov, I have been trying to get to this room for 14 years. I have been through worse approaches than this one. I have been colder, more exposed, more alone, and in greater danger than anything in this building represents. She held his eyes. Give me the drive. A long moment. Outside on the eastern approach, Cooper's voice came through the channel. Eastern Guards are shifting. Someone gave them a signal. They're moving. Jake said quietly into the channel. Hold. Sir, hold. Petrov said to Elena, you missed once. Yes, she said. That kind of mistake follows a person. Yes, she said again. It does. So why, Petrov said, and the studied warmth was gone now, and what was left was something that was finally honest, the voice of a man who has survived by reading people and is genuinely uncertain for perhaps the first time in a long time. Why are you certain you won't miss again? Elena was quiet for one breath. Then she said, because I'm not trying to kill you. Petrov's eyes narrowed. The drive, she said, Hashem. And Chun, and then you walk out of this building and you keep walking, and everything that's on that drive stays on that drive, and this ends. Why would I accept that? Because, she said, the alternative is that I don't walk out of this building either, and we both know how I feel about that. The silence that followed was the longest Jake had experienced in a room where things were actively happening. It had the quality of a held breath, the held breath of everyone in that space, including, he suspected, Petrov himself. And then Petrov did something Jake had not anticipated. He laughed. It was short and it was real. Not theatrical, not performed. A genuine involuntary exhale of something that might in different circumstances have been respect. He reached into his coat. Jake's weapon came up immediately. Petrov moved slowly with full visibility and withdrew a small device, black flat the size of a thumb, and held it out. Not to Jake, to Elena. She crossed the remaining distance and took it from his hand. She didn't look at it, she looked at him. And in her face was not triumph, triumph is loud. What was in her face was quiet, the specific quiet of a very long-running tension releasing like a cable under load that is finally carefully, correctly unclipped. Chun, she said. Petrov called a name in Russian. A door opened at the back of the room. And Dr. Marcus Chun, small, thin, blinking in the light, wearing the expression of a man who has survived something by sheer endurance and is not yet sure that surviving is real, walked unsteadily into the room. Elena crossed to him. Her hands went to his face, his wrists, his neck. Not the touch of a reunion, but the assessment of a trained physician, practiced and rapid. She said something to him quietly. He said something back. She nodded. Jake had his weapon on Petrov. Petrov had his hands visible, and his expression that of a man who has concluded a transaction that didn't go quite as planned, but remains on balance satisfied with the result in ways that are not yet fully visible. "Commander Miller," Petrov said. Jake said nothing. "She's remarkable," Petrov said. "I want you to know that I have always known that. Even in Sarajevo, even when—" He stopped. "Even after," Jake said flatly, "walk." Petrov looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and walked back through the doorway into the dark of the far room, and the sound of his footsteps moved away without hurry, without panic, without any of the sounds that departure under duress makes. Just walking. As if this had always been his exit. As if he had always planned to walk out of this building and had simply waited for the right conversation to make it happen. Jake held the weapon on the doorway for a 10 count after the footsteps faded. Then he said to the channel, "Cooper, Eastern Guards. They're pulling back, all of them, like someone told them to stand down." Jake let that land, let the implication of it settle Petrov withdrawing his forces. Not because he'd been defeated, because he'd gotten something. The conversation, maybe, or something in the conversation that was not visible yet. He filed it. "Move to extract," he said. "We're coming out the north face with one additional. Reyes Thorn, cover our withdrawal." "Copy," Reyes said, and his voice had more strength in it than Jake expected, which was the right kind of surprise. Jake looked at Elena Rodriguez. She had Chun's arm over her shoulder and was already moving him toward the north face egress. Her medical kit was open, and one-handed she was moving the man and assessing him simultaneously. Her face was focused, professional, the same face she'd had in the shelter over Reyes' shoulder. But underneath it, in the set of her jaw and the line of her mouth, there was something different now. Not lighter exactly, not relieved, not triumphant, but resolved, differently weighted, like something that had been pulling in one direction for a very long time had been recalibrated, and the pull was still there, but it was different now. Changed in its character, if not its presence. Jake fell in beside her, took some of Chun's weight from the other side. She looked at him briefly. "You dropped your arm," she said. "You knew what you were doing." A pause. "I wasn't completely sure." "I know," he said. "Neither was I." They moved through the north face entry and out into the cold and the dark of the mountain, and the teams sealed around them as teams do, instinctively, collectively, each person finding their position in the formation without instruction. Because this is the thing that training builds, the thing that survives. Contact and confusion, and the discovery that the mission is not what you thought it was. This, the team moving together in the dark, all of them, every one of them, including the woman they had misjudged in a Fort Carson briefing room who had turned out to be the person they needed most and hadn't known it. The extraction point was 6 kilometers back. They moved toward it through the mountain that did not care who lived or died on it, under a sky that was beginning at its eastern edge to think about the color that comes before dawn. And Elena Rodriguez moved with them with one hand on Marcus Chun's arm and the small black drive in her jacket pocket, carrying both the weight of what had been and the specific unfamiliar lightness of what had just at last been done. The 6 kilometers back to the extraction point took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Not because of enemy contact, because of Marcus Chun. The man was alive, and the man was walking, and the man had the specific determination of someone who understands that survival is not a passive state, that you do not get rescued by lying down and waiting, that you meet the people who came for you halfway. No matter what halfway costs your body, Jake had seen it before in hostages. The ones who survived long captivity intact were almost always the ones who had made a decision early on to stay in motion mentally and physically, to keep the machine running, even when running it meant running on fumes. Chun had that. Even moving at the reduced pace his condition required, even with Elena monitoring his core temperature every 30 minutes and making micro adjustments to his warming protocol, as they went, he kept his feet under him. He didn't complain. He answered Elena's medical questions precisely and without drama. He said at one point when Jake checked on him at a rest halt, "I'm fine, I've been in worse positions." Jake had looked at him, a 54-year-old nuclear physicist with frostbitten fingers and bruising along his left cheekbone, and the particular thinness of a man who has been fed just enough to keep him cooperative, and said, "We will not." Chun had thought about it with the seriousness of a man who takes all questions seriously. 1994. I was doing fieldwork in Kazakhstan. Wrong vehicle, wrong road. 3 days in a ditch before anyone found us. He had looked at Jake with eyes that were sharp and tired in equal measure. This was more comfortable than that. Jake had decided then that he liked Marcus Chun. Elena stayed close to Chun throughout the movement. Not hovering, she wasn't the hovering type he was learning, but positioned, within reach. Close enough to intervene if his condition shifted, and far enough to give him the dignity of walking under his own power. Jake watched her calibrate that distance and found not for the first time that everything she did in the field had this quality of precision. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. Everything exactly what the situation required and nothing more. At the 90-minute mark, with the team holding at a rest position and Chun sitting with his back against a rock and his eyes closed and his breathing steady, Elena moved to Jake's position. She said without preamble, "You said after." "I did. We're technically still before after, but I want to start." Jake looked at her. In the pre-dawn dark, with the cold beginning to take on that particular quality it has in the last hour before light, heavier, somehow more serious, as if the night is making one final argument, she looked like what she was. A person who had been carrying something for a very long time and had made a decision to put it down and was now working through the mechanics of actually doing that. "Talk," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Organizing." Not the silence of someone who doesn't know where to start, the silence of someone who knows exactly where to start and is bracing for the arrival of the words. 2001, she said. I was 26. I had just finished my surgical residency. I was recruited by an intelligence unit, not CIA, directly adjacent to it. Black budget, unacknowledged. The kind of program that exists in the spaces between departments where accountability is limited and oversight is theoretical. Jake said nothing. Let her go. They called us Wraith Division. 7 operators. I was the 7th. Wraith 7. She paused. My specialty was precision elimination, long range. I was very good at it. That's not pride, it's just the relevant fact. I had scores on qualification ranges that hadn't been matched in the program's history. What did they tell you the program was for? High-value targets, people who couldn't be touched through official channels. War criminals specifically, men who had been indicted by international tribunals, but who had enough protection, enough money, enough influence, that formal justice was never going to reach them. A beat. They told us we were the reach. And Petrov. Petrov was the 3rd mission, Bosnia 2001. He had been running ethnic cleansing operations for 2 years, documented, photographed, reported to The Hague. He had 3 different sets of protection, Serbian government officials, a Russian intelligence handler, and a private military network that made him effectively untouchable by conventional means. She said this without emotion, not because she didn't feel it, Jake thought, but because she had processed this particular sequence so many times that the facts had been worn smooth by handling. The mission was straightforward. I had a position, I had a window, 13 hours of waiting, that's not unusual. You learn to live in very small moments when you're waiting that long. You stop thinking in hours, you think in breaths. Jake understood this. He moved, she said, at the last second. Not because he knew I was there, I'm still convinced of that. Something else moved him, a sound maybe or instinct, the kind of random physical movement that has no reason behind it and costs nothing, and she stopped, breathed. I missed. She said it the way she'd said it to Petrov. Flat, claimed. The extraction team was already on the move toward my position when it happened. The miss created noise, not much, but enough. Someone was alert enough or lucky enough to respond before I could relocate. My team took contact 3 minutes after the shot. A pause that was heavier than the others. There were 5 of them moving to extract me. They died in a period of, I don't know exactly. It felt like a long time. It was probably 9 minutes. Jake said very quietly, you watched. Through the scope, she said. Yes. The weight of that, the specific, particular weight of watching through a scope with the magnification that makes distance feel like proximity, watching your people, Jake let it sit, didn't diminish it, didn't offer anything to soften it. Some weights need to be acknowledged at full size. Then Petrov walked out, she said, into the open, into what should have been my field of fire. I had another shot, I had a clear shot. She stopped. Jake waited. I couldn't take it, she said. I wasn't functional. After watching, I wasn't functional. And then he was gone. He walked out of my scope picture, and he was gone, and I was alone on that roof with 5 people dead because of a miss that had no reason and an empty window where my target should have been. Jake said, what happened after? Extraction. I was pulled out by the backup team 20 hours later, debriefed extensively. The program was terminated not because of the mission failure officially, but because of what the failure exposed about program structure. Too many moving parts. Too many people who knew too much. She paused. Wraith 7 was officially listed as deceased, program closed. Elena Rodriguez was reconstructed, the surgical credentials were real, the residency was real, everything was built on a real foundation. They gave me a life that could be lived above the surface. But you kept the training. You don't unkeep it, she said. It's not a skill exactly, it's more like a way of moving through the world, a way of reading rooms and terrain and people. You can cover it, you can bury it in a medical career and humanitarian postings and years of doing the exact opposite of what you were trained to do. But it doesn't leave. Jake thought about the Fort Carson briefing room, the way she'd sat, the back to the wall, the eyes on every exit, the way she'd reorganized the medical kit for a different kind of access. You stayed in medicine, he said. It was the only thing that felt opposite enough. If I was keeping something that could take life, I wanted to be spending the rest of my time saving it. It felt like not a balance, more like a counterweight. She looked at her hands. 14 years of surgery and field medicine in the worst places on the planet. South Sudan, Haiti, Yemen, the places where the damage is happening right now and no one is watching. It helped, but it didn't. It didn't finish it. No, she said, 'cause Petrov was still out there. And Marcus Chun, she glanced at Chun, who was still resting with his eyes closed. Chun was one of my contacts, she said. In the years after the program, not officially, nothing was official, nothing connected back to any institution that would acknowledge it. But in the world that Wraith Division moved through, you built a network of people who were also navigating things that couldn't be named. Chun was developing something, a tracking system detection technology that could identify specific nuclear signatures at ranges that weren't previously possible. The kind of technology that changes what's findable and what isn't. She paused. Petrov has spent the last decade building a private nuclear logistics network, not weapons acquisition, connecting buyers to materials. Chun's technology in the wrong hands could map every dark site Petrov has built and hand him a roadmap to everything he doesn't already own. Jake said, or in the right hands, it maps his entire network. Yes, she said, which is why Petrov took him, not to use the technology to prevent anyone else from using it against him. And the drive. The drive has what Petrov has been accumulating as insurance for 30 years. His network, his contacts, his operations, everything that would destroy him if it became public. She touched her jacket pocket. He gave it to me tonight instead of negotiating with you because you're the only person he respects enough to trade with, Jake said. She looked at him. He engineered this entire operation to get you in that room, Jake said. The kidnapping, the drive, the position, guards, all of it was a mechanism to get Elena Rodriguez standing in front of him in a room where he controlled the exits. Yes, she said. Why? She was quiet for a long moment. Because he's been doing this for 14 years too, she said. And I think Petrov is the kind of man who needs the person who failed to kill him to look at him and see that the failure cost something, that it mattered, that carrying it was real. She said this without pity, just assessment. He's not a man who can be destroyed from a distance. He needs to be seen. Jake turned this over, the psychology of it, the specific architecture of a man who had spent 14 years building to a single room in a single conversation. The drive is real, he asked. The drive is real. And Petrov just gave it to you. He gave it to me because the drive was never the point. The room was the point. Being seen was the point. She paused. And because I told him I wasn't going to miss again, and I think he believed me. And I think a man like Petrov, who has survived by accurately reading people, decided that his most functional option was to walk away with the acknowledgement he came for and leave the drive behind. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, Colonel Hayes knew all of this. It wasn't a question. Hayes knows most of it, she said. He was my handler in the original program. He's been monitoring Petrov's movements for years. When Chun went missing, he called me. A beat. He didn't tell you about my background because he needed the team to treat me as a medical asset until the right moment. If you'd known what I was going in, the dynamic would have changed. He used you, Jake said. He gave me the room I needed, she said. There's a difference. Jake thought about Hayes' his careful non-answers, his insistence that Elena stay on the mission, his particular confidence when he'd said I would trust her with my life. It all reread differently now, not deception for its own sake. Deployment of assets in the way an intelligence man deploys them selectively, precisely with the full picture visible only to the person holding the whole map. He was still going to have words with Hayes, significant words, but he understood the shape of it now. Cooper's voice came over the channel. Commander, we've got movement on thermal. 2 kilometers south, looks like a vehicle convoy. Afghan National Army markings. Jake said our extraction package. Running the IFF now. Yeah, looks like it. An hour ahead of the scheduled window. Either Hayes had pushed the timeline, which meant Hayes was tracking them more closely than Jake had known, or someone else had called it in. Jake looked at Elena. She was looking at the southern direction toward where the convoy was registering. Hayes moved the pickup, she said. Not a question. Looks like it. He was monitoring the comms traffic from Petrov's network, she said. When the guard stood down, he would have read that as the operation concluding. He moved the package to close the gap. She paused. He's thorough. He's something, Jake said. He stood, called the halt to end. The team assembled around Chun, who opened his eyes and got to his feet with the same determined steadiness he'd maintained for the past 3 hours. Elena was beside him in two-step, one hand on his arm, checking his face and his color and his gait, in the practiced way that Jake was beginning to understand was not separate from her other training, but integrated with it the same acute situational awareness applied to the human body rather than terrain. They moved south. The convoy reached them at a position marker 700 meters from their rest halt. 3 vehicles, 2 military, pattern trucks, and a lighter vehicle in the center. The door of the center vehicle opened before Jake could approach it. Colonel Robert Hayes stepped out. He looked exactly as he always looked, the bearing of a man who is comfortable with complexity, who does not require simplicity to function, who has been living in the gap between what is said and what is true for so long that the gap feels like home. He looked at Jake, then at Elena, then at Chun, and something in his face changed, something that was relief, genuine and unmanaged, the kind that surfaces when a worst-case scenario has not materialized. Dr. Chun, he said. Chun looked at him. Chun's face was not warm, not hostile, but not warm. Colonel, I'm functional, Chun said it with the brevity of a man who does not require small talk from the person responsible for the sequence of events that had put him in a mountain room for 6 days. Let's go. Hayes absorbed this without reaction. Then he looked at Jake. Commander. Colonel, Jake said. He said it in the specific way he'd said it before difficult conversations with superior officers level controlled, with nothing in the tone that announced what was coming, but nothing that hid it either. Hayes read it. Jake watched him read it. The intelligence man's face made the micro-adjustment that faces make when they are receiving information they expected and are confirming its content. In the vehicle, Hayes said. We'll talk en route. We'll talk now, Jake said. A beat. Hayes looked at the team around them, at Cooper, who was doing the particular neutral face he did when he was listening with his entire body, at Okafor, who was watching Hayes with the calm, precise attention that was more unsettling than any hostile expression, at Castillo and Thorne and Reyes, each of them holding their positions, but present in the conversation, in the way that a team is present collectively, weight distributed. At Elena Rodriguez, who was standing to Jake's left with her hands at her sides and her eyes on Hayes and nothing on her face that gave anything away. Hayes said, she told you. She told me enough, Jake said. You sent us in without complete information on the mission parameters, the target, or the background of a team member. People could have died from gaps in that picture that you chose to maintain. People could have died if I'd filled those gaps, Hayes said. If your team knew what Elena was, the dynamic in that room changes. Petrov reads rooms, Commander. He would have known if your team was treating her differently, and he would have adjusted accordingly. A pause. The conversation needed to happen the way it happened, with your team treating her as the medic until the moment when the medic wasn't needed anymore. You don't get to make that call without my knowledge, Jake said. In this case, I did. In this case, you did, Jake said. And I'm telling you that it doesn't happen again. Not with my team, not with anyone under my command. You want to run an intelligence operation in the middle of my mission, you tell me before we're wheels up and we negotiate what I can work with. Clear. Hayes looked at him for a long moment. The assessment of a man who has been in enough rooms with enough commanders to know when he's looking at a line that won't be moved. Clear, he said. He said it without resentment, without the wounded quality that some men in his position bring to moments of accountability. Just clear. The word of a man who has taken the measure of the situation and accepted it. Jake held the eye contact for one more second. Then he stepped back. Let's move. The team loaded into the vehicles. Jake took the front vehicle with Hayes. Elena was in the center vehicle with Chun still monitoring, still working the medic. And the other thing simultaneously, both of them always present, neither of them canceling the other out. As the convoy moved south, Hayes sat beside Jake in the dark interior and said after a period of silence that had the quality of a man organizing what he wants to say, the drive. She has it. I know. That was not part of the anticipated outcome. Petrov gave it to her. Hayes was quiet for a moment, then why? Because the drive was currency, Jake said, and what he bought with it was the conversation. Getting her in that room, being seen. He looked at Hayes. You knew he'd engineered the Chun kidnapping to draw her in. Hayes didn't deny it. I suspected. I wasn't certain until the comms traffic confirmed his direct involvement. And you sent her anyway. She asked to go, Hayes said. 14 years, Commander. She asked every time there was any intelligence movement that looked like Petrov. I kept her back because the conditions weren't right. This time the conditions were right because he was ready to end it. I could read it in the operational pattern. He was setting up a closing move, not an opening one. You read all of that and still didn't brief me. I briefed you what I could brief you, Hayes said. There are things in Elena's file that I cannot share without her consent. The rest of it, the Petrov connection, I judged it better for her to tell you in the field when the telling was necessary than for me to tell you in a briefing room when it would have been information without context. Jake considered this. The logic of it was sound, that was the infuriating part. In the abstract, as an intelligence decision, the sequencing had produced exactly the right outcome in that room. In the concrete, as a command relationship, it had placed his team in a situation they weren't fully equipped to navigate from the start. Both things were true. Jake held both. The drive, he said, what happens with it? It goes to an analysis team. What's on it, if it's what I think it's on, it will be enough to dismantle Petrov's network comprehensively. Not just damage it, end it. Hayes paused. Which means Elena Rodriguez as Wraith 7 will have accomplished the mission that Wraith 7 was originally created to accomplish, just 14 years later than planned. Jake looked at the dark outside the vehicle window, the mountain receding behind them. The eastern sky still holding its darkness, refusing to give up the night, but with that color at the very edge of it, the color that is not yet light, but is the memory of light, the promise of it, arriving before the thing itself. He thought about Elena in the center vehicle behind him, about the conversation on the mountain, about the way she looked when Petrov had used the name Wraith 7, the thing that had moved behind her eyes and been pressed back down, about the way she looked after. When the drive was in her pocket and Chun was on his feet and the room was done, that quiet that wasn't relief, but wasn't quite not relief either. The recalibration of something long under specific tension. He said to Hayes, what happens to her after? Hayes said, what do you mean? Her cover is effectively broken. We know. Chun knows. Petrov knows, and Petrov has people. Jake looked at him. What happens to Elena Rodriguez after this mission? Hayes was quiet for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, which told Jake the question was one he had thought about and not fully resolved. That depends on choices she makes, Hayes said finally. What choices? Whether she wants to stay under the medical cover, whether she wants to come in from the field entirely, whether she wants, he paused. There are roles for someone with her skill set and her medical credentials in programs that don't require her to be invisible. You mean programs that acknowledge what she is? Yes, Jake said. Does she know that's an option? Hayes looked at him, the assessment again, measuring what the question meant and where it was coming from. She will, Hayes said. Jake nodded, let it be. At the 2-hour mark from the convoy intercept with the forward operating base appearing in the distance, lights and structures and the particular organized appearance of a military installation that always looks after a time in the field, almost surreally permanent, Jake's radio came alive. Not the team channel, the direct command channel, the one that Hayes monitored but that reported to Jake's command structure independently. The voice on the channel was his operations officer back at the forward base, and the voice had the specific quality of a person delivering information they had triple-checked before transmitting, because the information is not the kind you want to get wrong. Commander Miller, we have an update on the Petrov situation. Jake said, send it. The individual you encountered at the objective, we've been tracking his egress since your radio check at the structure. He moved south from the objective on a vehicle route. 20 minutes ago, the vehicle stopped. A pause. Commander, the vehicle was intercepted by a second party at a position 40 kilometers south of the objective. We're still assessing the identities of the intercept party, but is he alive? Jake said, a longer pause. Unknown to the operations officer said. The vehicle is static, no movement from any of the occupants. We're tasking a drone for a closer look. Jake sat with this. The vehicle, static, no movement. He thought about Petrov walking out of that room, the measured walk, the unhurried quality of it, the sense that the conversation had concluded on terms that satisfied him. He thought about the drive and what was on it. 30 years of accumulated insurance, names, networks, operations, everything that would destroy the people connected to Petrov if it became public. He thought about the fact that Petrov had given that drive to Elena Rodriguez instead of destroying it. And he thought with a particular chill that is not from cold, the chill that comes from understanding arriving all at once in a single assembled picture. He thought about who else might have wanted that drive. Who else in Petrov's network might have been watching the mountain tonight? Who else might have had a very specific interest in ensuring that whatever conversation happened in that room did not result in Petrov walking away with 30 years of insurance intact? He said, get me an ID on the intercept party as fast as you can. Copy, Commander. He clicked off the channel. He sat for a moment in the moving vehicle with Hayes beside him, in the dark outside, in the base ahead, and he thought about the drive in Elena's pocket and what it meant that the man who'd given it away was now in a static vehicle 40 kilometers south. Then he turned to Hayes. Hayes was already looking at him, the face of a man who monitors multiple channels and had heard the transmission through his own earpiece. The face of a man who is processing the same picture Jake is processing and arriving by a different route at the same destination. Who else wanted him dead? Jake said. Hayes said without hesitation, that is a longer list than Petrov ever acknowledged. Is it a list you know? Hayes said parts of it. Are any of those parts going to come looking for that drive? The answer was in Hayes's face before the words arrived. Yes, he said. Jake closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Opened them. The base was 3 kilometers ahead. Down. The night was almost over. But the thing that had started on the mountain, the thing that Petrov had called a continuation of unfinished war, Jake Miller understood now with the clarity that comes from finally having enough pieces to see the shape of the whole picture, that it was not finished. It had not finished in that room. It had not finished when Petrov walked away. It had not finished when the drive went into Elena Rodriguez's jacket pocket and Chun had walked to the vehicle under his own power and the convoy had turned south. It had only changed shape. And somewhere behind them in a static vehicle on a road that led away from a mountain, whatever came next was already beginning. The forward operating base at 3 a.m. had the particular energy of a place that has been awake all night waiting for news and has just received it. People moving with purpose through the corridors. The medical team materializing the moment the vehicle stopped, 2 doctors and 3 nurses converging on Chun with the organized urgency of people who had been briefed on his condition and were ready to act on it. Chun let himself be taken. He had held himself together for 6 kilometers of mountain movement and 3 hours of vehicle transit, and now with the base around him and American medical personnel at his elbows, Jake watched the man finally allow the held thing to release. Not dramatically. Just the spine came down slightly. The jaw unclenched. The eyes, which had been sharp and alert through everything, took on a different quality. The quality of someone who has finally reached the place where they are allowed to be a patient rather than a survivor. Elena walked beside the gurney for 40 feet, talking quietly to the lead physician. Handoff information, vitals, the warming protocol, the specifics of his shoulder injury in its current state. Then she stepped back and let the medical team take him and stood in the middle of the corridor and watched them move him away. Jake stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "He's going to be fine." "I know," Jake said. His core temp stabilized about 90 minutes ago. The frostbite on the fingers is superficial. He'll have full function. She said this the way she always delivered medical assessments, precise, factual, the emotion carried in the fact rather than around it. "He'll be home by the end of the week." "Because of you," Jake said. She looked at him, "Because of all of you." Jake let that stand. It was true as far as it went. But it wasn't the complete truth, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to argue the point right now. Hayes appeared at the end of the corridor. He had his phone in one hand and the expression of a man who has just received information he was both expecting and hoping not to receive. He walked toward them with the pace of someone who has learned that bad news does not improve with speed, but that delay is its own kind of dishonesty. He stopped in front of Elena. "The drone footage came back," he said. She looked at him without expression. "Petrov's vehicle," Hayes said. "The intercept party." He paused. "3 men. We have a partial ID on one of them. He's connected to a network that's been competing with Petrov's operation for access to the same acquisition channels." A beat. "They weren't sent to recover the drive." Jake said, "Then what were they sent to do?" Hayes looked at him. "Petrov had a failsafe. In the event that he gave up the drive voluntarily under any circumstances, there was a standing order to his own people. Terminate." He paused. "He built his own kill switch into the operation." The corridor was quiet. Jake processed this. The specific cold architecture of it, a man who had engineered an entire operation around a single conversation, who had walked into that room prepared to give up his 30-year insurance policy, who had done so with full knowledge that the act of giving it up would trigger a standing order against himself. "He knew," Jake said. "Yes," Hayes said. "He knew when he walked into that room that giving Elena the drive meant..." "Yes." Jake looked at Elena. Her face had gone through something in the last 10 seconds. He could see it without being able to fully name it. Not grief, not shock, but the specific disorientation of someone who has just had the shape of a thing they thought they understood reveal itself as something entirely different. She had gone into that room to face the man who had caused the death of her team. She had come out with the drive and Chun, in the sense not of victory, but of resolution, of a long-running account finally settled. And now she was standing in a corridor learning that Viktor Petrov, the man she had spent 14 years failing to kill and then failing to forget, had known exactly what he was doing when he handed her that drive, had chosen it. She said to Hayes very carefully, "He wanted it to end." Hayes said, "That's my read. He built the entire operation, the kidnapping, the positioning, the room not to survive it, to end it." Her voice was level, absolutely level. The control that Jake had watched her maintain through a firefight and a mountain approach and a face-to-face with the man she had hunted for 14 years was still there. But underneath it, in the tension around her jaw and the way her hands had closed at her sides, something was working through that control like water through rock, patient and inevitable. "He used me to end it. He used you to finish it on his own terms," Hayes said, which is entirely consistent with the man. Control to the last available moment. Jake watched Elena absorb this, watched her stand in the corridor with a dead man's last decision settling into her understanding of everything that had happened and rearranging it. Not the outcome was the same. Chun was safe. The drive was in her pocket. Petrov was gone. The network would be dismantled. But the meaning of it had just changed. The account she had thought she was settling had already been settled on the other party before she'd arrived to settle it. He had simply waited for her to be the instrument. She said, "The drive is still real." "Yes," Hayes said. "What's on it will still dismantle what's left of his network." "Yes." "Then it doesn't change the outcome," she said. She said it firmly, deliberately. The statement of a person choosing to hold a position against the pull of a more complicated feeling. Whatever his reasons, whatever it doesn't change what happens next. Jake said, no, it doesn't. She looked at him. He said, you came here to finish something. You finished it. The man's reasons for how it ended don't revise what you did to make it possible. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you're easier to work with than I expected. People say that, Jake said. Cooper would like me to mention that he finds it less true. From somewhere down the corridor, as if summoned by his name, Cooper's voice carried, I heard that, sir. And Elena Rodriguez, for the first time since Jake Miller had met her in the Fort Carson briefing room, where she'd sat perfectly still with her hands flat on the table through the mountain and the firefight, and the room with Petrov, and the long, cold walk back, laughed. Not a polite sound, a real one. Brief and surprised, as if it arrived before she could decide whether to allow it, and by the time she realized what it was, it had already happened. It was the most human sound Jake had heard from her, and it landed with a weight that was completely disproportionate to its size. Hayes watched this with the expression of a man who has been doing intelligence work long enough to recognize the specific emotional signature of a person coming back to themselves from a very long distance. He didn't comment on it. He just said to both of them, debrief in 2 hours. The drive goes to analysis immediately. He looked at Elena. And I want you into the debrief. As what? She said. The laughter was gone, but something it had left behind was still in her face. A fractional openness that hadn't been there before. The medic or the other thing? As the person who knows what's on that drive and what it connects to, Hayes said. As the person with the most complete picture of Petrov's operational history. A pause. As both things, if that's what you are. She held his gaze. That's what I am. Then be both, he said, and he walked away down the corridor, phone already at his ear, moving into the next layer of the operation that hadn't stopped just because the most immediate part of it had resolved. Jake and Elena stood in the corridor, in the particular quiet that follows the departure of someone who has been carrying a significant portion of the weight of a conversation. She reached into her jacket pocket, took out the drive, held it in her palm, small and black and flat, lighter than what it contained. She looked at it for a long moment with the specific attention of someone not looking at an object, but at what the object represents. 30 years of a man's operational life, the thing he had built and held and finally deliberately given away. He could have destroyed it, she said, any time in the last 14 years. If the drive was his insurance, he could have destroyed it when it no longer served that function. She turned it over in her hand. He didn't. Jake said, he was keeping it for this. For giving it to me. Yes. She closed her hand around it. Then she walked to the medical station at the end of the corridor, where a corpsman was sitting at a desk, and she handed it across and said, this goes to Colonel Hayes' analysis team. Chain of custody starts now. The corpsman took it with both hands, and the expression of someone who understands that they are holding something significant. She watched him secure it. Then she turned back. Jake was waiting. She walked back to him and said, I need to clean up and get 4 hours of sleep before the debrief. You've got 2 hours. Then I need 2 hours. Medical bay is at the end of the east corridor, he said. There's a bunk room adjacent. The team uses it after operations. She paused. The bunk room was as she clearly understood a team space. Not a place she would have been directed to in any default version of this mission, the version where she was the medic and nothing else. She said, is that an offer? It's a direction, he said. You're part of this team. Use the space. She looked at him for a moment. That fractional openness was still in her face. He had the sense that she was deciding something not about the bunk room, but about what the bunk room represented, about whether to accept the category he had just placed her in. Then she said, thank you, Commander. Jake, he said, a beat. Thank you, Jake. She walked down the east corridor. He watched her go, and then he turned and went to find his team. They were in the team room, the standard debriefing adjacent space that every FOB has, functional and Spartan, with folding chairs and a table, and the remnants of whatever someone had been eating before the mission went active. Cooper was already in a chair with his feet on the table, and his eyes closed, but his posture at the particular angle that meant he was not sleeping. Okafor was sitting upright with his hands folded, looking at nothing visible. Castillo had his laptop open and was moving through imagery with the focused efficiency of a man who processes by working. Thorne was in the corner doing what Thorne did after hard missions, which was sit quietly and let his mind catch up to his body. Reyes was on a cot with his shoulder rebandaged and his eyes open and a cup of something hot in his good hand. Jake came in and pulled a chair and sat. For a moment, the room just held them all. The particular weight of a completed mission settling onto the people who ran it, the accumulation of every decision, every contact, every moment where things could have gone differently and didn't, depositing itself now that the operational tempo had stopped. Cooper said without opening his eyes, "She going to the debrief?" "Yes," Jake said, as the medic, as both things. Cooper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The shot on the eastern position." "Second one, that was a difficult shot." "Yes," Jake said. "Range, angle, wind, moving target." Cooper opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. "I've been shooting competitively for 16 years. I could not have made that shot in those conditions." The room was quiet with this for a moment. Okafor said Bosnia was 2001. "Yes," Jake said. "She's been carrying that for 25 years. 25 years, Jake confirmed. Okafor unfolded his hands and refolded them differently, the way he did when something was settling into a new arrangement in his thinking. And Hayes knew the whole time. Hayes has known since it happened. Reyes said from the cot, "The man who died tonight, Petrov." "Yes." "She didn't kill him." "No." Reyes turned his cup in his good hand. Is that something she needs to deal with? That she didn't, that it ended the way it ended instead of, I think, Jake said carefully, that's going to be her process to work through, not ours. Reyes nodded, accepted it. Cooper said, "What happens to her after the debrief?" Jake said, "Hayes indicated there are options, roles that don't require the cover. She could come in from the field, or she could go further in," Jake said, "as what she actually is, without the fiction." Cooper thought about this. Then in the specific tone he used when he had revised an opinion and was acknowledging it without announcing it, "She's good." "Yes," Jake said, "better than good." "Yes," a pause. "I was wrong," Cooper said. "About Fort Carson, about she doesn't belong here, I was wrong." Jake looked at him. Cooper was still looking at the ceiling. His face had the particular quality of a man who has held a position all his life and is finding that one of those positions was built on an assessment that the evidence has since corrected. It was not comfortable for him. It was not supposed to be comfortable. "Yeah," Jake said, "you were." "Okay," Cooper said, and nothing else. Because Cooper, for all his noise, had the specific quality of a man who does not extend apologies. He doesn't mean and does not append unnecessary explanation to ones he does. The two words were complete, and he let them be. Okafor said, "Are we going to talk about the room?" Everyone in the team knew which room he meant. There was only one room in the mission that qualified as the room. Jake said, "What about it?" Petrov had the exits covered. He had us committed. And Okafor paused, working through it. He gave it up. The drive, the leverage, everything. He walked away. "He chose how it ended," Jake said. "A man with that much power over the situation chose to give it away. A man with that much control chose the one remaining thing he still controlled," Jake said. "The exit." Okafor was quiet with this for a long time. The way Okafor was quiet, full, and considered. And Elena knew. She knew what would get him to hand it over. She knew him, Jake said, not as an adversary, as a pattern. 14 years of knowing how he thinks and what he needs and what he responds to. He paused. She used that knowledge. Tonight in that room, she used 25 years of history to get exactly the outcome we needed. "That's not a medic," Thorne said from the corner. It was the first thing he'd said since entering the room. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Jake. "That's an operator." "Yes," Jake said, "it is." The room held this. Then Reyes said, "Then she was always one of us." No one disagreed. The debrief happened at the 2-hour mark, as Hayes had said. The analysis team had the drive and was already pulling data. Hayes gave them a preliminary report during the first 15 minutes that had the quality of someone describing a discovery they are still in the process of making. The names on the drive, the network connections, the operational sites, the financial channels. The scope of it was as Hayes described it in the measured language of someone who understands the weight of what they are delivering significant. Elena sat at the debriefing table and answered questions with the specificity of someone who has been holding detailed knowledge for a long time and is finally in a room where it can be used. She knew Petrov's methodology. She knew the acquisition network structure, the key nodes, the most vulnerable connections. She described all of it clearly, without hesitation, without the careful management of disclosure that Hayes used, just the knowledge given directly to the people who needed it. Jake watched the analysts across the table realize in real time that they were receiving information that would have taken them months to develop through conventional intelligence means. He watched their questions change as the picture became clearer, becoming more specific, more urgent, chasing the lines that Elena was opening up. She gave them everything she had. At the 90-minute mark, Hayes called a pause. The analysts left to begin cross-referencing with existing data. Hayes, Jake, and Elena remained at the table. Hayes said, "There's a conversation I've been meaning to have with you for several years." Elena looked at him. "About what comes next?" "About what comes next," he confirmed. "I'm listening," she said. Hayes set his hands flat on the table. It was Jake noticed the same position Elena had held her hands in the Fort Carson briefing room, the position of someone who is about to say something that requires stillness in the body because the words are going to have weight. The Wraith program was terminated because of structural failures, Hayes said. Accountability gaps, oversight problems. The things that programs built in those gaps always eventually run into. He paused. Over the past several years, there has been a reconstruction of something similar. Different structure, proper oversight accountable to a chain that can actually exercise control, operators who exist on record, work that is acknowledged. He looked at Elena directly. It needs people with your skill set, your specific combination of skills. Elena said, "You're asking me to come back." "I'm presenting it as an option," Hayes said, "with the full picture this time. You'd know everything. Your team would know what you are. There'd be no cover." She was quiet for a moment. Then the medicine. "You keep it," Hayes said. "It's part of what makes you valuable. The medical capacity, the field assessment, the surgical skill, those are not incidental to the role. They're central to it." He paused. Both things acknowledged. Jake said nothing. This was not his conversation to lead. But he was present in it in the way that he had been present in the mission, as the context that made the conversation possible, as the person who had created unintentionally and then very intentionally the conditions under which Elena Rodriguez had been seen for what she was. She looked at Jake. He said, "Don't make the decision based on the last 48 hours. Make it based on what you want the next 14 years to look like." She held his eyes. "And if what I want the next 14 years to look like includes working with this team," Jake said, "that would be Colonel Hayes's call." Hayes said, "That would be a yes." Elena looked back at the table, at her hands which were flat on the surface. She looked at them for a long moment, the surgeon's hands, the shooter's hands, the hands that had been both things for 25 years, without ever being acknowledged as either. Then she said, "I want a week before I give you an answer." "You have a week," Hayes said. She nodded. She stood from the table and picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She looked at Hayes. "The Chun technology, the detection system. It'll be properly protected this time. And used," she said, "not shelved, Chun." "That's above my pay grade," Hayes said, "but I'll push." "Push hard," she said. She left the room. Jake and Hayes sat at the empty table for a moment. Hayes said, "She'll say yes." "Probably," Jake agreed. "You know that." "She came here," Jake said. "People who by going to say no don't come." Hayes looked at him with the expression of a man who has just been told something true, in fewer words than he would have used himself, and found it useful. "No," he said, "they don't." Jake stood. "I'm going to check on my team." "Miller." He stopped. Hayes said, What happened in that room, the way it resolved, that was because she trusted your team enough to tell the truth in the shelter. Before contact. Before she had to." He paused. "That doesn't happen with every team. Or every commander." Jake said, "She had reason to trust us." "She had reason not to," Hayes said. "Cooper made that clear at Fort Carson." "A beat. You made it possible anyway." Jake held this for a moment. Then he said, "That's the job. He left the room and walked down the east corridor toward where his team was. The base was lightening around him, not dawn yet, but the hour before it, when the dark begins to dilute and the shapes of things become slightly clearer without yet being fully visible. The in-between hour, the one that belongs to people who have been awake all night and are still standing. He found Elena in the corridor outside the bunk room. She was standing with her back against the wall and her eyes closed and her arms loose at her sides. Not sleeping, the same standing down posture he'd recognized on the mountain. Present but withdrawn. He almost walked past without interrupting it. Then she said, without opening her eyes, "He chose it." Jake stopped. She said, "Petrov, he chose the whole thing. The room, the drive, the standing order." She was quiet for a moment. He was tired. "Yes," Jake said. 25 years is a long time to be what he was." "It's a long time to be what you were too," Jake said. She opened her eyes and looked at him. In the corridor light, with the base beginning to move around them and the debrief done and the drive in the hands of people who would use it, she looked not lighter. He'd thought before that resolution might look like lightness. It didn't. It looked like something more solid, more grounded. The specific quality of a person who has come to rest after a long time in motion. She said 25 years, and it ended in a conversation. "Most things do," Jake said. She thought about this. Then the team. Cooper. He said he was wrong. He said it directly. "It's done." "People don't usually." "Cooper does," Jake said. "He's loud in both directions." She almost smiled. "I noticed. He'll be loud about this too, eventually in the right direction." She nodded, looked down the corridor at the bunk room door, then back at Jake. "I'm going to say yes." "I know," he said. "I decided in the debrief, but I wanted the week to be sure I wasn't deciding from," she paused, "from the momentum of it, the past 48 hours. "That's smart," he said. "Is it?" She looked at him steadily. "Or is it just the habit of someone who has spent 25 years making sure every decision is defensible?" Jake considered this. It was a real question, the kind that doesn't want a reassurance but an honest answer. "Both," he said. "Those things aren't opposites." She accepted this. Jake said, "Get 2 hours." "I will." She pushed off the wall and moved toward the bunk room. At the door, she stopped and turned back and said, "Jake." He waited. "In the canyon, when you dropped your arm." She looked at him with the directness that he'd recognized as one of her consistent qualities, the willingness to say the thing without the architecture around it. "No one has done that before, in the field. Just stepped aside and trusted me to know what I was doing." Jake said, "You knew what you were doing." "I wasn't 100% sure. 80% is enough," he said, "if the operator is good enough." She held his gaze for a long moment, then she went through the door. Jake stood in the corridor alone for a moment. The base moved around him. Somewhere down the hall, he could hear Cooper's voice lower than usual and talking to someone, the register of a man having a real conversation rather than performing one. Okafor, probably. They did that after hard operations found a corner and talked through whatever needed talking through, the way people who have been through things together process those things together. Jake thought about the mountain, the first shot that had come from the ledge he hadn't considered securable, the clean sound of it, the way the firefight had changed in the instant after the hesitation, the reassessment, the pack recalculating when something they hadn't accounted for entered the equation. He thought about the 8 years missing from Elena Rodriguez's file and what they had made her into. Not just as an operator, as a person, the specific kind of person that those years produce. The person who moves through every room, checking the exits, who reorganizes the medical kit for a different kind of access, who can be still in the way that only people trained to be still are still. The person who had walked into a room with Viktor Petrov and come out with the things she needed without firing a single shot. He thought about what Thorne had said. She was always one of us, not because of the training, not because of the skill set or the history or the 8 years the file didn't speak about. Because of the specific thing that operators share that has no formal name, the willingness to walk toward the hard thing when walking away is an option. The choice to be in the room, the choice to be on the mountain, the choice made over and over in small and large ways to be present in the worst of it, rather than at a safe distance from it. Elena Rodriguez had been making that choice for 25 years, in operating rooms in South Sudan, in field tents in Yemen, On a rooftop in Bosnia in 2001, with 5 people dying in the margins of her scope. And on a ledge above a canyon in Afghanistan with a team she just met and a rifle and 3 problems that needed solving before her team ran out of time. The dawn was coming. Jake could feel it more than see it, a change in the quality of the darkness, a shift in the pressure of the air. The mountain out beyond the base perimeter was resolving from a darkness into a shape becoming itself again after the long night had borrowed it. Jake Miller had spent 22 years leading people into hard places and bringing them home. He had learned to measure success not by the absence of damage, but by what survived intact: the team, the mission, the core of the people who ran it. Everything that was supposed to survive this mission had survived it. And one thing that hadn't been on any mission brief that no intelligence package had listed as an objective had survived it too. Elena Rodriguez, both halves of her, acknowledged and standing, and for the first time in 25 years, no longer required to be one thing or the other. Both things at once, in the open. The ghost in the medic's uniform had finally found the room where she could stop pretending to be only one of the 2 things she was, and in that room with that team on that mountain, she had discovered what most people spend a lifetime hoping to find, and never do that: the fullness of who she was, all of it. Every hard-won and costly and irreducible part of it was exactly enough. She had not missed, not this time, not ever again.